Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. I bear witness that no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah Ta'ala, the one who has no partner and no similar, the one who has no length and no width and no depth and no perimeter, the one who is not a volume and is not in a place. And how could he be in a place when he existed before time and space? He created everything except himself, including you and your actions. Nothing occurs except by his will, both good and bad, he destined to happen. He speaks without sound, letter, or language, not Arabic, Hebrew, nor Korean. He's not light, he's not a spirit, he has nothing in common with human beings. He's not in the direction of up, down, right, left, front, nor back. And whatever you imagine in your mind, Allah is different than that. And I bear witness that our noble, unrivaled Master Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is the slave of Allah, his final messenger, and the best of all of God's creations. May Allah unite us with him in paradise and grant us a drink from his basin. And may Allah increase us in patience, humility, knowledge, and comprehension, and help us to put our knowledge into practice, and grant us all sincere intentions. Ameen. Allahumma ameen. We're continuing in the book, The Straight Path, As-Sirat al-Mustaqim, a text in Aqidah written by the great scholar of our times, the great scholar of Aqidah and Hadith and Fiqh and many other sciences, Abdullah al-Harari. May Allah have mercy on him. Ameen. In the text, we've made it to page 301. To page 301, which means we are now very near the end of the book. We are now very near the end of the book. After discussing the matter with Amin Muhammad, the next book I intend to do is a text in Shafi'i fiqh known as Al-Muqaddimah Al-Hadramiyya, the Hadramite introduction. It's a very excellent text. Inshallah, we'll begin going over that after we complete this book. Imam Amin, inshallah, will have information probably next week on where you can order it, inshallah ta'ala. I'll try my best not to finish the book this week. It says on page 301, it says, al-ijtihad wa taqleed, ijtihad and imitation. So in this chapter, you know, in this book, the main purpose of this book has been to clarify the aqidah of the Muslims, the aqidah of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And a big part of it was refuting some of the false ideas that are circulating right now. Okay? False teachings that liken Allah to the creation. False teachings that say Allah is in a place. False teachings that say Allah is attributed with movement. False teachings that say you have to take everything in the Quran literally. False teachings that say Allah did not create evil. False teachings that say humans create their own deeds. False teachings that say that things that happen were not destined to occur. Okay, false teachings that say we're not permitted to do tawassul, which is to use created things as a means when we make dua to Allah. False teachings that say it's shirk to seek blessings by created things. There are a number of topics that we've gone into and refuted, including the ones I just listed, although that's not an exhaustive list. And this last chapter of the book here addresses a topic that also is a false claim which has become widespread. It's the notion that people don't have to follow madhabs. It's this idea that every single Muslim is capable of reading the Quran for himself, reading the Hadith for himself, and figuring out how to practice on his own, and that there's no need to follow the scholars. Okay, this topic is extremely important And we're going to talk a little bit today, insha'Allah ta'ala, about it. It says ijtihad and imitation. What do we mean by ijtihad? We're going to talk about it. But in short, ijtihad is the job of a mujtahid scholar. A top-level scholar, what he will do is he will examine all of the sources of Islamic evidence, including the Quran, including the strong hadith, including the consensus of the scholars, including qiyas, which is a tool at his disposal, including the Arabic language, including all of the sources of evidence in our religion. He gathers evidence, and from that evidence, he extracts the rules of the religion so that we end up with, in the end, a legal code, which we refer to as the Sharia. We end up in the end with a legal code that spells out in great detail what the rules are that we need to live by. Okay, it spells out in great detail what is obligatory upon us to do and how do we do those things properly. What is haram for us to do? What is recommended for us to do and how we do those things properly? What is disliked for us to do? Okay, what sorts of things render an action valid? What sorts of things render an action invalid? This is all fiqh. And ijtihad is a process of taking our religious texts and producing from it that legal code. Okay, some people are qualified to do that work, and other people are not qualified to do that work. Those who are not qualified to do the work, since they can't do it themselves, what do? They ask the people who can do it. It's just like in your regular life. If you haven't been to medical school, if you haven't studied medicine, if you haven't been trained as a doctor, then when you have a medical problem, what do? You go ask a doctor. Okay? If you haven't been to law school, if you aren't trained in the legal process, then when you need to go to court, what do? You hire a lawyer because they know what they're doing and you don't. Okay? And, this applies to every field. It's not just doctor and lawyer and engineer and those fancy things. Even like a library, you go into a library, there are librarians in there who have studied library science and know more about libraries than you ever could. Okay? How they tell you, don't put the book back yourself, put it on the cart, let them put it back, because they know more about where the books go than you do. Okay, even something as simple as that, if you haven't been trained in it, what do? You rely on those who have been trained. And Islam is a topic that's very deep and highly interdisciplinary. It's not enough just to know the Quran. It's not enough just to know the Hadith, but there's a massive amount of knowledge that you have to master before you're qualified to actually interpret it. And those of us who haven't mastered those things, we have no choice but to then rely upon those who have mastered those skills. It's really basic common sense. But the shaitan has come into our communities and whispered so much stuff that you got people rejecting the very idea of scholars. They deny that someone like Imam Shafi'i is any better than them or any more knowledgeable than them, which is absolute insanity. That's like that's like a seventh grader or even a 7-year-old, like a first grader or a second grader, saying he knows more physics than Albert Einstein. And then when you ask him to produce some physics equations, he can't. When you ask him to explain some physics concepts, he can't. But he insists he knows physics better than Einstein. Okay, that's kind of the situation we see in our communities. If it weren't so disheartening, it would be laughable. If it didn't make you want to cry so much, you would laugh at it. Let's read the book. We're on page what? 301. Page 301. It says, Ijtihad is extraction of judgments for which there is no explicit text that can only have one meaning. So the short answer when we say what is ijtihad It's when a mujtahid answers a question that doesn't have a clear answer in our religious texts. You see, there are some things in the Quran and in the strong hadith that are written so clearly that there's no possible way you can misunderstand it. For example, La ilaha illallah is very clear. If someone asked, how many gods are there? We would say very quickly, La ilaha illallah. There are no gods other than Allah. Okay? That's clear. A mujtahid scholar, when he is asked the question, are there gods other than Allah? He's not going to answer that question with his opinion. He's not going to put his opinion into it. Because whenever the religious texts, meaning what Allah and his messenger said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whenever the religious texts are perfectly clear, then it is the lot of the Muslim to submit to it. The Muslim does not consult his own opinion. The Muslim does not form his own opinion. Rather, he submits and he says what Allah and his messenger said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because it's clear. So he gives up any claim to have an opinion of his own, and rather he accepts into his heart what Allah and his messenger said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But that's if the text is very clear, meaning it's explicit and cannot bear any meaning other than that one very clear meaning. In these cases, the mujtahids do not make ijtihad. They do not try to answer the question with their own opinion. Rather, they simply state what is perfectly clear in the deen. But there are a lot of questions that come up, and the answer to these questions are not always clearly stated in the religious texts. Many times it requires a scholar of great understanding to figure out the answer to that question using the religious text. They extract an answer from the religious text. I'll give you an example just so you understand what I mean. It says in the Quran, in Surah An-Nisa and also in Surah Al-Ma'idah, where Allah Ta'ala is mentioning things that break wudu. Allah Ta'ala says, أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ, which means, if you take it literally, or you touched women. So if you take this ayah literally, it would mean that for a man simply to touch a woman breaks his wudu. But there's some uncertainty about whether this word lamestum, you touched, whether this word means a simple touch or whether it means something more than that, like a lustful touch, or maybe it means sexual intercourse, or maybe, this word touch, it's unclear exactly what it means because there's several things it could mean. And so this is a case where, because the text is not perfectly 100% clear, known for certain what it means, the scholars have to gather evidence and deduce the meaning of the sentence. And in this particular case, the different mujtahid scholars applied their dalils, they extracted their conclusions, and they did not all agree. Imam Shafi'i concluded that a simple skin-to-skin touch breaks wudu. Imam Malik concluded that it needs to be a touch where either the person experienced pleasure or sought pleasure by the touch, even if it was not skin-to-skin. Okay, this is an example. These are the only two madhabs I've studied, but this is an example where you have two different opinions in two different madhabs based on two different understandings of the same text, because the text itself was not the kind of text that's explicit and can only bear one meaning. It's possible to understand it in more than one way, and the Shafi'is understood it one way and the Malikis understood it a different way. It's this act of ijtihad, of taking our text and extracting from the text the rules by which we need to live. That process is what produced madhabs. The fact that this scholar arrived at conclusion A and that scholar arrived at conclusion B means that there's two madhabs on this issue. Okay, I'm just putting that out there to make sure we understand what madhabs are. Some people will try to tell you a madhab means you're following a man instead of following Allah. Or they'll say you're following a man instead of following the messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Or they'll say you're following people when you should be following Quran and Sunnah. And all of these things are just like little shady, shaitanic ways to confuse you. Okay, every madhab is directly tied to Quran and Sunnah, directly tied to it. Okay, they can support every single teaching in the madhab with evidence from Quran and Sunnah and the other types of religious evidence, because Quran and Sunnah are not the only types of religious evidence. But when you follow a madhab, what you're doing is you're following a set of teachings that has been demonstrated to be in accordance with Quran and Sunnah, and has been checked and double checked many times over the centuries to make sure it's consistent, to make sure it doesn't contradict itself, been checked and double checked so that weak opinions get replaced by stronger ones, so that errors are identified and corrected, so that you can be confident that what you are following is the strongest opinion, the most correct understanding of the deen. This is why we follow madhabs. And this task, ijtihad, I'm going to read it again, the first sentence here. It says, ijtihad is extraction of judgments. When it says judgments, it means the religious rulings, the religious laws, the sacred law, Sharia. Ijtihad is extraction of judgments for which there is no explicit text that can only have one meaning. So it's deriving the rules of the religion on cases where the religious rule was not perfectly clear already. This is ijtihad. You can think of it as bringing clarity to that which is unclear in the deen. Continuing in the book, it says the mujtahid is the one who is qualified to do that, ijtihad. So the person who has the qualifications to do this process, the one who is qualified to make ijtihad, is called a mujtahid. It says the mujtahid is the one who is qualified to do that, ijtihad, by having memorized the verses related to judgments and the hadiths related to judgments. Okay, so in order to be a mujtahid scholar, one thing you have to do is you have to memorize every ayah of Quran that pertains to religious judgments. And you have to memorize every hadith that pertains to religious judgments. What else does it say? And you need to have knowledge of their chains and narration. So you're not just memorizing the metin of the hadith, the part of the hadith that tells you what the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or what he did, or describes something about him. Okay, the part that most Muslims tend to be interested in is called the metin. It's not enough to be a mujtahid for you just to memorize the metins of all those hadith that relate to religious rulings. You have to also memorize their chains. Okay, the chain of transmitters. It says, and they need to know the situations of the narrators of the chain. So the people that are in the chain, it's not merely that you just memorize the names of the people in the chain. No, you need to know about those people. Okay, you need to know when they were born, when they died, who their teachers were, who their students were. That way you can identify if someone's missing from the chain. If you see this person in the chain and the next person mentioned was not the teacher of the first person because they never met, their lives didn't even overlap, someone's missing in the chain. Okay, you need to know the dates that these people lived. You need to know who their teachers were, who their students were. And you need to know about them individually. Were they good Muslims? Were they upright? Okay, because in order to be a trustworthy narrator of hadith, it's required that you be both upright and precise. Okay, to be upright means that in your practice of Islam, you avoid all of the enormous sins and you don't do so many small sins that they outnumber your good deeds. and you restrain yourself such that you observe the manners and etiquettes of your peers. The person that does those three things is said to be upright in the deen. But being upright in and of itself doesn't make you trustworthy. You have to also be precise. Because if you're someone who makes a lot of mistakes, you heard a hadith and then when you tell it to someone else, you messed up the wording of it. You added in something that wasn't originally there, or you left something out that was originally there, or you put it in your own words in a way that seemed the same to you, but really changed the meaning. Okay, if you do these kinds of things, then the scholars will identify you as someone who's not precise. And if you're not precise in your narrations, if you don't pass it on exactly the way you heard it, then you will not be considered trustworthy when it comes to narrating hadith. Okay, so it's not just about knowing the ayahs and knowing the hadith. It's also about knowing the chains and knowing the states of the people in the chains, the situations. What else does a mujtahid need to know? It says, and the abrogating and the abrogated. So in our deen, there's something called abrogation. Okay, sometimes Allah will address the ummah, okay, meaning Allah will give a message to the ummah, which will of course be conveyed to us by his messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This message may be in the form of an ayah of Quran, or it may be in the form of something the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is not an ayah. In either case, it's an address that's addressed to us. Okay, the messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is informing us that which we need to know, or that which is useful for us to know. Okay, these addresses, whether they be ayahs or hadith, these addresses, they sometimes contain within them a dalil to indicate some kind of action, to indicate some kind of religious ruling, to indicate whether something is obligatory or haram or recommended or disliked or neutral. Okay, for example, Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةِ, establish the salat. This is an address, okay? And this particular address contains within it an indication that establishing the salat is an obligation. Okay, so we understand from that address some kind of religious ruling that we're now obligated to establish the salat. Abrogation occurs when an address is addressed to us, and this address indicates that some religious ruling which was previously established by an earlier address is now no longer in effect. And it happens in such a way that if this new address were not made, then the old ruling would have stayed in effect. This is called abrogation. And in order to be a mujtahid scholar, you need to know which things are abrogated and which things are abrogating. Okay, the abrogating address would be the new one that you might say replaced the rule in the abrogated address. To be a mujtahid, you need to know these things because you can't base your teachings on something that's abrogated. What else does the mujtahid need to know? It says the general and the specific. When we say that something is general, we mean the wording, like the language, the literal words that are used in the expression are words that encompass two or more things. That makes it general because it's not specific to one thing. Okay, the specific things are specific to one thing. But if the wording encompasses two or more things, then that wording is now general. Okay, the mujtahid scholar needs to know which things in the Quran and the Hadith are general and which things are specific. He needs to know, what else does it say? It says, and the absolute and the restricted. Okay, when we say that something is absolute, we mean that it is not restricted. Okay, the address, the ayah, the religious text, the Quran or the Hadith, it mentions something without mentioning some kind of restriction along with it. Whereas the restricted things are cases when a restriction is mentioned with it. I know this is sometimes hard to understand. It's very abstract, but I'll give you an example. In Surah Al-Mujadala, there's an ayah that says, وَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ. It mentions that if a person says a certain thing to his wife and doesn't divorce her immediately, then this person will have to pay a kafara, which is to tahriru raqaba, like to free a slave. Okay? It says free a slave. This is absolute. It's not restricted. It doesn't say that that slave has to be any particular kind of way or that you have to free it in any particular kind of way. It just says free a slave. Okay? There's no restriction mentioned with it. But in Surah An-Nisa, in the ayah that deals with if you kill a believer, it specifically says it's restricted. It says, فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مُؤْمِنَةٍ. It says you free a believing slave. In this ayah, it's restricted. Okay, it says you need to free a slave, but it has the restriction on it that that slave has to be a believer. Okay, you're not freeing some kafir slave, you're freeing a believing slave, a Muslim slave. Okay, it's important for the mujtahid to understand the difference between when something is restricted and when something is not restricted. Okay, because as we'll see later, in cases where the dalios disagree with one another, in cases where dalios are in conflict with one another, the mujtahid needs to find a way to resolve the conflict. So what that means is he needs to give precedence to stronger dalios over weaker dalios. He needs to be able to recognize strong and weak. Okay, he needs to give precedence to specific statements over general statements, and give precedence to the abrogating over the abrogated, and give precedence to the restricted over the absolute, and give precedence to that which is connected over that which is separated, and give precedence to that which is muhkama over that which is mutashabiha. Okay, you remember we did a chapter earlier in the book about ayat that are muhkamat, meaning they can only be understood one way, and ayat that are mutashabihat, that support multiple interpretations. The mujtahid has to give precedence to the ones that only have one interpretation over the ones that have multiple interpretations. Okay, the mujtahid has to give precedence to a nas over a zahir. You know, a nas is a text that's explicit and can only have one meaning, whereas zahir is something that can have multiple meanings, but there's an apparent meaning to it. Okay, there's a meaning that seems more likely on the surface. Okay, but the mujtahid needs to give precedence to that which can't be interpreted any other way. And he needs to give precedence to that which has been clarified over that which remains vague. Okay, these are all things that the mujtahid has to do in the process of resolving the conflicts that arise. You know, many of you, mashallah, or many Muslims in general, they haven't really done any work on really understanding the difficulties that arise when you try to understand this deen. You know, one example I sometimes give for people to understand what I mean when I say conflict, there's an ayah in Surah Al-Kawthar. It's a very short surah, the shortest surah in the Quran. Many of you probably know it. You know the surah, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar, fasalli li rabbika wanhar. This ayah, fasalli li rabbika wanhar, contains in it two direct commands. Fasalli says pray to your Lord, wanhar, and sacrifice. Okay, this ayah was revealed about Eid al-Adha. You know, it contains a command to pray and a command to sacrifice. All right, let's just focus on the command to pray for right now. It commands us to pray. So if this ayah were the only dalil you looked at, you would probably conclude that praying the Eid prayer is obligatory, because Allah Ta'ala said to pray, and he said it in a form which is imperative. It was in the form of a command. He said, pray to your Lord. But as you read more and study more, you might come across, for example, a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari and in other texts in which a man with disheveled hair, a Bedouin man, came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and asked him, which salats are obligatory upon me? And the Prophet alaihi salatu wasalam said, 5 salats. And the man asked, are there any other than that are obligatory upon me? And the Prophet alaihi salatu wasalam said, no, but you can do extra. Okay. This hadith, which is sahih and found in Sahih al-Bukhari, indicates that the only salats that are obligatory are the 5 salats that we do every day. So therefore, the ayah in Surah Al-Kawthar, which seems to suggest that we have to pray the Salat al-Eid, there's a conflict here. You have one dalil that suggests it's an obligation to pray the Eid prayer, and you have another dalil that suggests it's not an obligation to pray the Eid prayer. So which one is it? This is what I mean when I say when you study these religious texts, you get conflicts. And so questions arise that need answering. It's now unclear. Do we have to pray it or not? If I choose not to pray the Eid prayer, am I sinful for that? Or am I not sinful for that? Well, the Mujtahid scholars answered that question. And you'll find that they did not all answer it in the same way. In the Shafi'i madhab, we say that the Eid Salat is sunnah. It's not an obligation. In other madhabs, they say that it is an obligation. Okay, this doesn't mean that, what I'm trying to say is you shouldn't get confused about it. Like people, common regular Muslims, they oftentimes get confused. They heard one thing, and then they heard another thing, and now they don't know what to believe, and now they're getting frustrated. They're all confused because some people say you have to, some people say you don't have to. They don't know what to do. Okay, and the reason for their confusion is because they're listening to everybody. Whereas if they would have just picked a madhab and said, hey, what do the Shafi'is say about this? Then if they asked all their questions to Shafi'is, they would get consistent answers and they would not get confused. Okay, if they asked all their questions to Malikis, they would get consistent answers and they would not be confused. Okay, but because they're listening to everybody, they're hearing all kinds of things and they're getting confused and they're getting frustrated, and it doesn't need to be that way. All right, both of these opinions are valid opinions supported by evidence from the Quran and Sunnah. These are opinions that were arrived at through a very rigorous process of ijtihad. Okay, but they're different madhabs. All right, instead of trying to resolve the two, you got to keep them separate in your mind. Say, by this madhab, you have to, by this madhab, you don't. End of story. Don't try to think that it's both obligatory and not obligatory at the same time. That's impossible. Okay. But anyway, this is some of the knowledge that the mujtahid needs to master before he's qualified to do ijtihad. What else does he need to know? We're still on page 301, middle of the paragraph. It says, likewise, he will have mastered the Arabic language in a way where he memorized what the expression of those texts refer to. Okay, so in addition to knowing those things that we talked about, his level in Arabic language is very high, to the point where every single word and every single phrase and every single expression that was used in any of those ayahs or hadith that we talked about, the ones that refer to legal judgments, he knows for every single one of those words and expressions and phrases, he knows the history of how those words, expressions, and phrases have been used in the Arabic language. He can give you quotes showing that this word has this meaning because he memorized some verse of Arabic poetry where he can say this word has this meaning because he memorized it in some ayah of Quran. Okay, he has evidence to support the meanings of the words, the possible meanings of the words. Okay, so he knows when he encounters these words in these ayahs, in these hadith, he knows what those words are referring to. He knows what they mean. It says, i.e., which means that is, he knows what those texts are. He knows what those texts are in reference to, according to the language in which the Quran was revealed. Okay, what does that mean? It means that according to the language in which the Quran was revealed, which is a very high level of Arabic, which we refer to as Fusha, it's like proper classical Arabic. In the Fusha language, he knows what those words and expressions and phrases could potentially mean. In the Fusha language, he knows what those words, phrases, and expressions are referring to. In which language? Fusha, the classical Arabic language that was spoken natively by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the majority of the Sahaba. Please note that Fusha, the classical Arabic that we're referring to, is no longer a living language. There's no longer anyone on the earth that speaks it natively. Everyone who knows Fusha studied it as a second language and learned it, including Arabs. Okay, Arabs who are born in Arabic-speaking countries and don't speak any language other than Arabic, what they speak is modern Arabic, some modern dialect. What they speak is not the same as classical Arabic. Okay, modern Arabic today is about as different from classical Arabic as modern Spanish is from classical Latin. Spanish is just, Latin evolved into the modern day languages of Spanish and Portuguese and French and Italian and Romanian and some others. These languages are just the modern dialects of Latin, but they're very different than classical Latin. A modern day native speaker of French, if he picked up some Cicero, he would not understand it. He might have an idea because he's going to see a lot of similarity in a lot of the words, but he's not going to be able to just understand it with precision and nuance. Similarly, a native speaker of Arabic today, if he picks up the Quran, he's not going to understand it with precision and nuance, although he might think he does. And that's where it gets very dangerous, because someone who thinks they know what they're talking about but doesn't actually know what he's talking about can mislead a lot of people, a whole lot of people. What else does it say? We're not done talking about the things the mujtahid needs to know. It says he would also know what the mujtahids have agreed upon. Okay, we're talking about consensus. There's something, our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that the ummah will not reach consensus, meaning unanimous agreement on a subject, and be misguided. So this means that whenever the mujtahids, of an era, all unanimously agree on something, then they're guaranteed to be correct. These mujtahids are human beings. They're not infallible. A mujtahid can make a mistake, okay? But whenever the mujtahids of an asr, the mujtahids of an era, whenever they all agree unanimously, then our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has told us it's impossible that they would all be mistaken. Okay, when they all agree, it's guaranteed that they're right. Okay, it's guaranteed that they're right. And so since we know that they're right, this means, therefore, that any scholars that come later cannot disagree with it, because it's been established that what their opinion was is correct. So if you were to choose any opinion other than that, that means you're intentionally choosing misguidance, because their opinion is the guidance. And if you disagree with it, then you've chosen misguidance. Scholars are not permitted to go against the consensus. That's why it says here, he would also know what the mujtahids have agreed upon. Because if he does not know that, we do not feel safe about his breaching a consensus. That is the consensus of those who were before him. Okay, so a mujtahid scholar, he needs to know what the mujtahids before him agreed upon so that he does not go against the consensus. And then what's the last condition here? It says, above that is a great condition in ijtihad, and that is fiqhun nafs, genius. That is great strength of understanding and realization. Okay, the most crucial out of all of these qualifications we just mentioned here, the most crucial one is that the person has to be a genius. Okay, normal, regular, run-of-the-mill human intelligence is not enough to be able to be a mujtahid. Above average human intelligence is not enough to be able to be a mujtahid. You got to be off the charts smart. Okay, you got to have genius because it's absolutely crucial. Like to be a mujtahid, it's crucial that you be able to synthesize in your mind large amounts of information, that you be able to resolve multiple conflicts simultaneously. Okay? And doing all of that without falling into some kind of logical fallacy or some other mistaken understanding or some other type of improper inference. Okay, you need to be able to keep all of that stuff straight in your head while at the same time juggling it and synthesizing it and baking it into a cake. Okay? You got to be able to do all of that stuff up here. And it's not something that the common person is able to do. There's another condition, which it says here in the book. It says trustworthiness is also conditional, which is being clear of major sins and of persistence in doing small sins in a way that they overcome his good deeds in number. Okay, this is what the scholars of hadith refer to as uprightness. According to this text, the author, may Allah have mercy on him, is saying that in order for a mujtahid to qualify as a mujtahid, he has to be trustworthy. Okay, he has to be upright. The strong opinion is that this is not a condition. Okay, the strong opinion is that if a person were an enormous sinner, but he was a genius, and he had all the other qualifications, then that would mean he is a mujtahid. And like all mujtahids, he would not be permitted to follow someone else's ijtihad. He would have to follow his own ijtihad. Even though he himself is not trustworthy, he still has to follow his own ijtihad because he's a mujtahid. However, trustworthiness is a condition for it to be permitted to follow the mujtahid. So if you imagine a mujtahid who's an enormous sinner, he has to follow his own ijtihad for the simple fact that he's a mujtahid. Okay, but no one else can follow his ijtihad. No one, like he has his own madhab because he meets the qualifications, but no one can follow that madhab because the person is not trustworthy. So you can't take any of his sayings. You can't accept his sayings from him. So trustworthiness, you can think of it as a qualification in order for a mujtahid to be followed by others, but not a qualification for him to be able to do his own ijtihad, which he is obligated to do. MashaAllah. And what's the last sentence in the paragraph? It says, as for the imitator, he is the one who has not reached this level. So what the author, may Allah have mercy on him, is saying is that there are two categories that Muslims fall into. You're either a mujtahid or you're not. If you're a mujtahid and you met these qualifications, well then it is now your obligation to do ijtihad and answer these questions that need answers, bring clarity to these things that are unclear. That's your job. That's what you have to do. And you have to do it with sincerity, which means what you think is the right understanding, you yourself have to follow if you really think it's right. So the mujtahid follows his own opinion because he believes his opinion is correct. As for the person who is not a mujtahid, this person is called a muqallid, an imitator. It's in this book, it's referred to as an imitator. If you are a muqallid, an imitator, then you're not qualified to answer these questions yourself. So what do? You don't try to answer them. If you're not qualified, you don't attempt to do so. Just like if your appendix is causing you pain, you don't attempt to remove your own appendix yourself. You don't do surgery on yourself if you're not qualified. What do? You go to someone who is qualified. This is what the muqallid does. This is what the imitator does. Since he's not qualified to do it himself, he goes to a mujtahid scholar, asks his question to the mujtahid scholar, and the mujtahid scholar provides his answer. And then that muqallid, that imitator, does it the way the mujtahid said to do it. This is a muqallid. Now, a muqallid must follow a mujtahid. Or to put it in today's modern terms, a muqallid must follow a madhab. Okay, because a madhab is the set of conclusions reached by the ijtihad of the founder of the madhab, as well as the conclusions reached by the other mujtahids within the madhab who followed the same methodology that the founder established. So when you follow a madhab, you're following mujtahids, all of whom are using a consistent methodology. So the muqallid, the imitator, must follow a madhab, but there's no rule that says he has to pick one madhab and follow it for his whole life. Okay, a muqallid is free to follow mujtahid A. He can follow madhab A, or he can follow madhab B, or C, or D. He can follow whichever one he wants. If he wants to be Maliki, he can be Maliki. If he wants to be Hanafi, he can be Hanafi. If he wants to be Shafi'i, he can be Shafi'i. If he wants to be Hanbali, he can be Hanbali. Okay? It's his choice. And in fact, he can even switch it up from time to time. He can be Maliki on Mondays and Shafi'i on Tuesdays and Hanafi on Wednesdays. Okay? He can do that. All right? Because he's a muqallid. The mujtahid has to follow his own ijtihad, but the muqallid doesn't have any ijtihad of his own. So all he has to do is follow a qualified mujtahid's ijtihad, and it doesn't have to always be the same one. However, my advice to you, my advice to all of you, and my advice to myself is, in fact, to pick one madhab and stick to it. Not because we're obligated to do that, we're not, but because this will avoid confusion. If you start learning one madhab and then learning another madhab, then in most cases, they're going to get mixed up in your mind. You're going to try to remember something and you're going to end up mixing what you heard here with what you heard there. You're going to confuse yourself and you may end up doing something in a way that neither madhab acknowledges as valid. Now, the example I like to give is like wudu. In the Shafi'i madhab, when you wipe your head, there's no particular amount of the head that you have to wipe when you make wudu. A Shafi'i can just stick his finger under there and just boop, and this counts for wudu. In the Maliki madhab, the strong saying is that you need to wipe your entire head. Okay, that's a disagreement between the two madhabs. The madhabs also disagree about what breaks wudu. Where the Shafi'is say if a man touches a woman skin to skin, it breaks wudu. The Malikis say only if he was seeking pleasure or experienced pleasure will it break wudu. So what you can sometimes get is a person who makes wudu without wiping his whole head. And he says, oh, this wudu is valid by the Shafi'i school. So he continues with his day believing he has wudu. And then when he buys something at the supermarket and the cashier gives him his receipt and her finger touches his finger, he will then say, well, or he might say, In the Maliki school, that doesn't break wudu because I didn't feel any pleasure. I wasn't seeking pleasure. It was just an accident. You might think, oh, I still have wudu because according to the Malikis, that doesn't break wudu. And then he might go to the masjid and make salat. And what happens? The Shafi'is would say his salat is not valid. Because according to the Shafi'is, he broke his wudu when that lady touched his finger. So he doesn't have wudu and his salat is invalid. The Malikis would say his salat is invalid also. Because while the Malikis agree that the touch did not break wudu, the Malikis would say he never had wudu in the first place because he didn't wipe his whole head. He only wiped a tiny bit of his head when he made his wudu. So according to the Malikis, he never had wudu. So both madhabs agree that this man does not have wudu. So when he went to make his salat, both madhabs agree that his salat is invalid. This is the danger that can happen when you mix madhabs. Okay? You might be thinking, oh, I'm following Shafi, and think, well, I'm a muqallid. I can choose any madhab I want. I'll just follow Maliki now because it's convenient. Well, if you mix them up and you're not careful, you'll end up doing something that both madhabs reject while you're busy thinking that what you're doing is acceptable. Okay, to avoid this kind of situation, my strong advice to you and to myself is to pick one madhab and follow it exclusively. And then once you've learned it very well, once you've learned it well enough that you're not going to get confused about it, then you can consider learning a second madhab. Okay, but until you learn the first one very well, don't consider it. Now, yes, if you have a special case, sometimes because of your special circumstance, the madhab you've chosen for yourself is difficult. So yeah, you can go to a shaykh, tell him about your special case. He may be able to point you to a different madhab that will be easier in that one area. So you might end up being someone who follows Shafi'i in everything except fasting. For example, you might do your fasting by Hanafi school. Or you might follow Shafi'i in everything except in purification and prayer. You might do that by Maliki school. Okay, this is also fine. But don't go mixing madhabs in one issue. Like the example I gave where he followed part of the wudu rules by Shafi'i and part of the wudu rules by Maliki. No, that's not going to work. Okay, that's not going to work. MashaAllah. There's a lot more I want to say on this topic, but I actually need to go. Maghrib has been in for a minute, and I can't really afford to wait any longer. So I'm going to check out, inshallah. I'm going to remind all of you that the next book we're going to do is the Muqaddimah al-Hadramiyya, the Hadramite introduction. We will start that book once we complete this book. Next week, inshallah, Masjid Muhammad will have information to put into the chat boxes, on where you can acquire a copy of the book. It's Shafi'i Fiqh, inshallah ta'ala, so it's going to be fun. If you have questions, please ask it real fast. I'll answer it real fast, inshallah. Someone asks, if something isn't clear in the Quran, he's basically asking, is it necessarily true that there's a hadith that will make it clear? No, it's not necessarily true. Okay, I give you an example of something mentioned in the Quran where the hadith doesn't clarify it at all. There's some ayahs in Surah An-Nur confirming that the person who commits zina is to be whipped 100 times. Okay, and then there's an ayah in Surah An-Nisa that says the slave girl gets half the punishment of the free woman. Okay, which suggests, therefore, that the slave girl who commits zina, her punishment will be 50 lashes. But the Quran doesn't mention anything about a slave man. Does a slave man get half the punishment of a free man? Or does he get the same punishment of a free man? The Quran is silent on this. And when you read the hadith, You don't find any hadith about a male slave committing zina. There are some hadith about women slaves committing zina, but you don't find a hadith mentioning a male slave who committed zina, such that the Prophet ﷺ confirmed whether his punishment is half of the free man or all of the free man's punishment. It's not in the hadith. It didn't clarify the question. This is an example where the Shafi'is solve this question by doing what we call qiyas, which we'll get to. It's coming up in the book. But the Shafi'is concluded that the male slave would get half the punishment of the free man. And this is by qiyas, by saying the male slave is similar to the female slave. And therefore, if the female gets half, the male would get half. But it's not necessarily the case that everything that's mentioned in the Quran will have a hadith to clarify it. And sometimes, even if there is a hadith, that doesn't necessarily mean that the mujtahid understands it the way you would think. The Hanafis say that the Eid Salat is an obligation, even though there is a hadith that says only 5 Salats are an obligation. They still say the Eid Salat is an obligation. Okay, so every madhab has its methodology, its own way to solve these puzzles that show up when you have lots of evidence, and some of it is clear, and some of it's not clear, and some of it conflicts, and some of it doesn't conflict. You got to solve these puzzles. Okay, it requires genius. It truly requires genius, and not every genius solves a puzzle the same way, and not every genius arrives at the same conclusion. MashaAllah. We'll meet next week, inshallah, same bat time, same bat channel. If I didn't get to your question, definitely do ask me next week. Let's say La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. Barakallahu feekum. I'll see you next week, inshallah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.